Okay, so part two of this week's topic is on deviance and difference. So, in the first part, I was talking very broadly about socialization processes, and what I'm going to talk about here is norms and deviance in terms of how they are part of that process, I suppose. Um, so, in terms of that Goffman-esque learning the script thing, part of what makes up that script is the different values, morals, norms, tastes, ethics, and stuff like that are the kind of dominant ways of being in society and the dominant rules of society, I suppose. So once you're born into the world, you're born into a particular culture and a particular society, and then it has these values, morals, and ethics, etc., that you kind of have to learn to be able to function and be able to be like a good citizen, a good student, a good child, a good son or daughter, or all these kind of things. So you have to kind of, I suppose, understand what these are to be able to develop an understanding of that script to be able to perform yourself. And these things are important in a sense because if you don't have these kind of things to learn, that script, you're kind of faced with this existential void. It'd be very difficult to live in the world without having some norms and things like that to be able to kind of model yourself on. So they exist in this sense in a functional way. That is, they help society function smoothly. And this is particularly, I suppose, in kind of day-to-day interactions. It would be weird if you get in an elevator and someone kind of faces you and like everyone's here and everyone's facing you this one person looks at you that way. That would make everyone feel uncomfortable. Why that's a norm, you have to face towards the door, I'm not sure, but like those, little things like that allow us to kind of go through the world, without, feeling too weird and, being able to feel relatively comfortable. So these kind of little things like that happen all the time. There's kind of, if you're in a particular social situation, how loud you're allowed to talk or whether you're allowed to talk at all, these, allow that situation and whatever's in that space happen normally. If it's a thing that needs to be quiet, talking loudly would be seen as being rude, and therefore there'd be social sanctions around that. In terms of clothing, workspaces, for instance, tend to require different kinds of clothing, whether that's for safety or whatever. Again, having a uniform in that sense allows one to kind of quite easily know what to do at work. It allows us to identify people in various ways, particularly, soldiers and cops and people like that. So, again, these norms allow society to have shared things that we can all identify with and to, and allow us to kind of move through the world in a particular way that helps things function smoothly. The problems with things like norm and deviance is they tend to always favour some individuals or groups over others, and this is where power comes to work across different levels. Norms, the scripts in that sense, tend to always seem to reflect and favour some people's preferences and social positions over others. And again, later in the course, we'll do whole weeks that look at this in particular lens through class, through sex and gender, and through race and ethnicity. More broadly, though, when it comes to norms, what it means to be normal, it means in that kind of broad dichotomy there has to be something that seems to be weird or deviant. Deviance in the sociological sense doesn't have to be something that's about breaking the law. It can be more of that kind of everyday interactions where one transgresses certain expectations on a kind of very micro scale. And it can move, up in terms of, different versions of it, like, taking drugs or, getting a mohawk or, wearing the wrong clothes in the wrong situations. Different things have kind of different relations to this dichotomy. Tattoos are a good example of this. 20 years ago, tattoos tended to be only kind of be worn by, or at least stereotypically worn by, people from low socioeconomic backgrounds or were associated with criminals or particular cultures, such as the Maori culture. But today, it actually seems to be increasingly deviant for young people not to have a tattoo. They've become much more socially accepted on a much wider scale in Australia. So, these things change over time. They're not necessarily set in stone. And that's an important thing to consider when it comes to how social change happens. What I'm going to do for the rest of this part is talk about a particular way of thinking about deviance that I think is quite helpful, and particularly for sociological perspective at a first year level for making the normal look strange. If you're doing intro to criminology, you'll probably see a bunch of different conceptual ways of thinking about deviance, and this will be one of them. I'm just going to focus on this one here for the lecture today, which is labelling theory from Howard Becker. For Becker argued that deviance should not be necessarily understood by focusing on the person who does the deviance. Becker was more interested in like how something became to be defined as deviant. And so for Becker, deviance is created by the people who get to make the rules, who then get to label anyone who breaks the rules as deviant. Importantly here, the rules, and again, not necessarily laws here, this is kind of social norms as well as, legalities. These things are applied differently to different groups of people. So I've got a quote there from Becker. I'll read through this. Social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infraction constitutes deviance, and by applying those rules to particular people and labeling them as outsiders. Outsiders is a really key term in what I'm talking about here. From this point of view, deviance is not a quality of the act of the person commits, but rather a consequence of the application by others of rules and sanctions to an offender. The deviant is one to whom the label has successfully been applied. Deviant behaviour is behaviour that people so label. What Becker is attempting to do here is shift attention away from the behaviour itself to the power that some people have over others to make a label stick and to create the label in the first place. But really importantly for Becker, what this means in terms of socialisation and senses of self, the consequences for individuals that have had this label successfully applied. Now, it's important to think about, I think, deviance in this way around the processes of these, what's defined as deviant, rather than the individual act itself, because it's very easy to show how acts of deviance are, legal for some and illegal for others, or whatever. So, drug taking is a good example of this. I'm going to kind of use stereotypes here, but upper middle class professionals taking cocaine in their own household is kind of sanctioned or viewed very differently by kind of ICE and addicts that are on the street. There's a very different application or even pursual of the law, even though the deviant act, i.e. taking illegal drugs, is largely the same thing. The contextual situation of the act and the people that do it create the way that those sanctions are applied. Even something like killing someone, is totally fine in some respects. Countries have the death penalty. They train soldiers to go to other countries to kill people. It's obviously not okay in more general public situation, but the act itself of killing someone isn't universally deviant in that sense. Now, we can argue whether it should be or not, but in terms of, predominant norms, laws, and ethics, there's different situations where it's totally, an acceptable thing to do. As a soldier, in fact, killing someone else is your job. So again, this is the kind of broader application of thinking sociologically here, is that the act itself is not actually what's deviant sometimes. It's the way that it's kind of judged, who's doing it, in what context, and how those with kind of social power get to apply that label and apply those rules to others. So we can see this, that this is a good way of thinking about the way power works and the way those kind of norms that I was talking about previously are kind of defined differently for different people, and people therefore have different relations to them. This is particularly important because most people commit deviant acts at some point or other. Pretty much everyone has, and I'd imagine that everyone has today, right? Maybe you accelerated to go through an orange light, or, were late to class, or all these little things in day-to-day life. You can kind of break these social norms. These things tend to have very little effect on, how you're viewed by others more often than not. These kind of broader, more powerful groups get to say what's normal and what's deviant, and this is the kind of more sociological relations of inequality that comes to norms that we're interested in this course. So, again, I'm going to be quite broad here, but like colonial settler notions, like Australia, white people in those colonial settler nations, white people, define black culture as deviant. It's kind of tends to be seen as shiftless and ignorant and lazy and dangerous and violent and backward and primitive, all those things that we've been looking at in the kind of post-colonial stuff earlier on in the course. Later in the course, we'll see how, in terms of class relations, middle classes are the ones that tend to define the working class as deviant in different ways. They have bad taste, they're vulgar, they're lazy, they're bludgers, and all that kind of stuff. In patriarchy, again, we'll look at this in the week on sexuality and gender. Men define what's unfeminine in many ways and have kind of a bunch of labels to kind of put those kind of social sanctions in place. And they dominate institutions where gender norms are often defined. More broadly, in my own research area of youth studies, adults define what is deviant for young people. They eat too many avocados and therefore can't buy a house, even though, the wage to house price ratio is just out of control compared to previous generations. They decide when they're, old enough and responsible enough to vote or drive and things like that, even though, say, with the vote, it seems to be that, 16-year-olds are just as kind of politically knowledgeable and motivated as, 50-year-olds. So these are kind of very much common sense norms that kind of seem to be dominant in society. We come into the world and are socialized through these, but again, particular powerful groups get to define them. Your relationship to them largely kind of then defines, how you perform your sense of self. And from Becker's point of view, the people that get particularly labelled, the outsiders, often therefore take that label into themselves and kind of define themselves in that socialization sense. They become stigmatized, and that label becomes part of who they are. And this is particularly the case with crime. Becker talks about how, the label of the criminal, and particularly if this is at an early age, becomes a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy for that person. If you're treated as a deviant from an early age, you're likely to take on that deviant identity and then, embark on a deviant career. And that deviant career there is a term that's not talking about a job per se. It's just kind of a deviant life trajectory. So in very much Goffman-esque terms, once you're labelled a deviant, and if that becomes part of who you are and how you think about yourself, it becomes part of how you learn your lines. And this means that, the very idea of choice becomes somewhat cloudy, I suppose. Much of the common sense analysis would say someone that's a criminal kind of points out that they've made the wrong choices. What Becker's work here is kind of arguing in many ways is that, what choice does someone have from an early age if they're labelled this way and becomes a sense of self of who they are. Labelling, I think, is particularly useful for thinking about the consequences of many of the disciplines that students in this course will be studying. Social work, psychology, criminology, all the stuff in the legal system, even education systems, human sciences, sociology, they all kind of play a role in creating these labels. Their expertise intrudes into people's lives. So much of the research in youth studies and critical criminology shows that if a young person from an early age becomes, to the attention of the law, and, there's kind of class, gender, and race inequalities, that means some people are much more under the microscope of the police than others. Once they enter that system and labelled a delinquent or a deviant or a criminal, this kind of thing, then that kind of identity becomes part of the way they think of themselves, and it's much more likely then to be that self-fulfilling prophecy of, reproducing the behaviour that became problematic in the first place. Once someone defines themselves as a criminal, they will often then take up different values and ethics than the mainstream. And, you can see that in, the different ways that things like gangs and stuff like that have worked. And we'll look at subculture theory later in the course to look at things like that in more detail. So these kind of ways of thinking about values, norms, tastes, which we'll look at in some detail later in the course around consumer culture and class, are ways of kind of thinking about the way power works in that everyday micro level, that kind of symbolic interactionist way. This perspective is important for thinking about how power works. Even those practicing in ways that they think are doing good, the teacher, the psychologist, the social worker, may be reinforcing inequalities and discriminations through those kinds of systems. And it's also a way of thinking beyond this kind of agency and structure divide, particularly the idea of kind of free choice and, people having complete agency to do the right thing, in inverted commas, all the time. Teenagers exposed to juvenile justice system has agency per se, they have choice. And their choices may seem irrational and even self-destructive, but from their own perspective, those choices are part of the script that they've been socialised with. The values, how these values are constructed, very differently depending on your place in social space. And we'll look at different versions of this kind of thinking through the course. We'll look at Bourdieu's notion of habitus and stuff around class, Judith Butler's work on performativity and gender, and in the week on race and ethnicity, we'll look at the idea of racism without racists to think about some of these kind of values and norms. In the next section, though, we'll look at a very prominent perspective to think about moving beyond this binary through the work of Michel Foucault.